How did one of the greatest cities in history rise and fall? What's the story behind the Tower of Babel, and where does the biblical whore of Babylon come in? Let's break it down step by step, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. Babylon came onto the historical stage fairly late for this region, around the turn of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Before then, a small settlement had existed there since the late 4th millennium BC, but for a long time it wasn't of much significance. The name Babylon is the Greek version of the Akkadian Babylon, meaning Gate of God. That Akkadian word itself goes back to an even older Sumerian term, Kadingira, which also translate as Gate of God. The first references to Babylon in historical records come from the period of the Akkadian state's decline, during the reign of its last king, Shar-Kali-Shari, the great-grandson of Sargon the Great. At that point, Babylon was still just a small town with no real political importance in Mesopotamia. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed, the city fell under the control of the 3rd dynasty of Ur and became a provincial administrative center run by officials sent from Ur. Babylon had a remarkably favorable location, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, right at the crossroads of trade routes and irrigation canals, and on the boundary between two cultural and political worlds, Sumer in the south and Akkad in the north. This gave it perfect conditions for future growth. Still, for a long time, Babylon stayed in the shadow of the older, more powerful city-states of Mesopotamia. By the late 21st century BC, the 3rd dynasty of Ur had collapsed under attacks from Amorite tribes in the north and Elamites in the south. In 2004 BC, the Elamite king Kendatu sacked Ur, and Mesopotamia fell into a period of fragmentation. The city-states regained their independence and began competing for control over land, canals, and trade routes. Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, Nippur, and all others vied for dominance. In this climate of rivalry, Babylon finally had the chance to step out of the shadows. In 1894 BC, the Amorite leader Sumu-Abum took power in the city. From this point on, Babylon became politically independent. It wasn't yet powerful enough to challenge the leading cities of the region like Larsa or Isin, but it held on to its autonomy and gradually grew stronger. Its rise was supported by an efficient administrative system inherited from the time of Ur's rule, and by its strategic location. In 1792 BC, Hammurabi, the 6th king of the first Babylonian dynasty, ascended to the throne. At that time, Babylon was still just one of many Amorite city-states in southern Mesopotamia. Its position was stable, but the city remained a secondary power. Regional dominance belonged to Larsa, which controlled vast territories reaching as far as Ur. Isin had already lost its former influence, while in the northeast, the states of Eshnunna and Mari held sway. To the north, Assyria was only beginning to rise. It was in this political landscape that Hammurabi launched the campaigns that would ultimately transform Babylon into the capital of the greatest kingdom of its age. Hammurabi inherited a solid bureaucracy and a stable economy from his predecessors. Early in his reign, he focused on strengthening his rule at home. He repaired irrigation systems, brought order to the provinces, and reorganized taxes. These efforts bolstered royal authority and created the economic base for future expansion. The real transformation of the Babylonian kingdom began in the middle of Hammurabi's reign. In 1763 BC, he defeated Larsa, taking it along with Ur, Uruk, and other key southern cities, leaving Babylon unchallenged in the region. He then turned his focus north and east. Eshnunna, which had long remained independent and closely tied to Elam, was conquered in 1761 BC. Around the same time, fighting broke out with the Kingdom of Mari on the Middle Euphrates. In the end, Hammurabi's army captured and looted Mari, and its territory was absorbed into his kingdom. After these victories, Babylon rose to dominate southern Mesopotamia and much of the north. Hammurabi's rule stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Middle Euphrates, covering the region's key farming lands and trade centers. He governed this vast territory through a network of appointed governors, keeping control over canals, trade routes, and markets, securing stability and channeling wealth into the capital. Under Hammurabi, Babylon grew into the political and religious heart of the region. Marduk, the city's patron god, was elevated to the top of the Sumerian Akkadian pantheon. The king of Babylon was not just seen as the ruler, but as an earthly representative of the supreme god carrying out his will. Babylonian society was divided into three main classes. At the top were the Awilim, free landowners who could defend their rights in court and take part in political and public life. They were mostly nobles, wealthy landowners, merchants, and the military elite. Below them were the Muskanim, literally those who bow down, a landless class without full citizenship rights. They usually rented land from the crown or the temples and had to give part of their harvest in return. Still, they could own personal property and bring cases to court, though with limitations. For instance, an Awilim's testimony carried more weight than a Muskanim's, and punishments for the same crime were harsher for the latter. Originally made up mostly of farmers, over time, the Muskanim also came to include royal officials, craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers. At the very bottom of the hierarchy were the Wardum, slaves with no rights whatsoever. People became slaves through war captivity, unpaid debts, or as punishment for crimes. They could belong to the king, a temple, or even private owners. Slaves had no personal property and were treated as possessions that could be sold, mortgaged, or rented out. If a free person injured a slave, it was seen only as damage to someone else's property, and the offender simply had to pay compensation. Beyond the social hierarchy, family ties and economic roles also shaped Babylonian society. Families followed a patriarchal model, with the man as the head of the household and holding near absolute authority over its members. Women, especially from the upper classes, had some property rights. They could own land, serve as priestesses, and even run businesses. Still, they were formally under the authority of men. Priests and priestesses linked to the cult of Marduk and other gods held a special status. They were highly respected and often freed from taxes and duties. Hammurabi's greatest legacy was his Code of Laws, the most famous and best-preserved legal collection from ancient Mesopotamia. It was carved into a black diorite stele and placed in the center of the capital so that everyone could see the laws that govern the state. In its prologue, Hammurabi declares that he received these laws from the god Marduk to establish justice on earth, to destroy the wicked and unjust, and to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. This statement highlights the sacred nature of royal power and presents the law as an extension of divine will. For a long time, the code was thought to be the first in history, though today we know that is not the case. The Code of Hammurabi touched on almost every part of life: trade, farming, family matters, crime, court procedures, and property disputes. But the laws were not applied equally. Punishments depended on the social status of both the offender and the victim. A free person, for example, might get away with a fine for an offense, while a slave could be executed for the very same crime. The victim's status also mattered. Killing a slave was treated as a minor offense, while killing an Awilim was seen as a serious crime. Many of the laws followed the principle of an eye for an eye, especially when both parties were of equal rank. At the same time, the code also offered social protections, with rules defending widows, orphans, and tenant farmers, and regulating debts and working conditions. Hammurabi's code set out the idea of royal power as something above private interests, meant to protect the public order. It was a tool of centralized control, bringing society under one set of laws. Backed by the authority of both king and god, this legal system became the foundation of Babylon's stability during Hammurabi's reign. One of the strongest and most enduring associations with Babylon is the idea of temple prostitution. Even in antiquity, the city was seen as a place for luxury and excess. The Greek historian Herodotus, for instance, claimed that every woman in Babylon was required at least once in her life to give herself to a foreigner in the temple of the goddess Ishtar, Later, biblical writers picked up on this theme, portraying Babylon as a symbol of sin and corruption, which gave rise to the lasting image of the whore of Babylon. The historical reality, however, is far more complicated. There's no archaeological evidence that organized temple prostitution ever even existed in Babylon. What Herodotus described as a religious rite is now thought by most scholars to have been either an exaggeration or a misinterpretation of local practices. Mesopotamian texts do mention priestesses of Ishtar, including the Kadishtu, women who may have taken part in fertility rituals. But whether those rituals involved sexual acts in a literal sense is very difficult to say. It seems more likely that the ritual sexuality in the cults of Ishtar and other goddesses was symbolic, expressed through ceremonies, music, dance, or perhaps theatrical performances. Greek authors, however, interpreted these traditions through their own lens of Eastern decadence. In that sense, temple prostitution as we usually imagine it is more myth than fact. Though it is a remarkably persistent myth, one that helped cement Babylon's reputation as a city of sin. After Hammurabi's death in 1750 BC, the throne passed to his son, Sumu-abum. He inherited a vast empire, but holding it together proved far harder than expanding it. On the surface, Babylon still looked powerful, but under Sumu-abum, the first cracks began to show. The economy, strained by his father's endless wars, started to collapse. Southern cities like Uruk, Isin, and Larsa soon rose in rebellion, with Ur and Nippur resisting most fiercely. In the end, southern Mesopotamia slipped from Babylon's control and began drifting toward independence. The north brought new troubles as well. Assyria, once subordinate to Babylon, was steadily growing stronger. Around the same time, Kassite tribes from the Zagros Mountains began appearing in records, first as mercenaries, raiders, and minor troublemakers. At first their raids were sporadic, but gradually they settled in the northeast, they built strongholds, and began inserting themselves into Babylon's administration. The names of Sumu-abum's successors have not come down to us, and their reigns have left little trace. The lack of sources itself is a sign of decline, both political and cultural. By the mid-17th century BC, Babylon's power had fractured. The kingdom's territory shrank, local rulers acted independently, and the weakened state opened the door for new northern powers. First Eshnunna, then Mitanni, and later the Hittites. Around 1595 BC, the Hittite king Mursili I launched a sudden invasion of Babylonian lands. He swept through northern Mesopotamia and struck straight at Babylon. The city fell. The Hittites looted it and killed the last king of the Amorite dynasty, Samsu-ditana. The blow was devastating for the old Babylonian kingdom. Central power collapsed, the administrative system fell apart, many priests and nobles were killed while others fled. Cities were left in ruins, and the fields were destroyed. But the Hittites did not stay. After seizing their spoils, they withdrew to Anatolia, leaving behind a political vacuum in Mesopotamia. Into this vacuum stepped the Kassites. Babylon was too weak to resist, and the Kassites quickly took the city. Yet instead of plundering or destroying it again, they chose to build on its existing institutions for their own purposes. This moment marked the beginning of a new era in Babylon's history. The first decades of Kassite rule were a transitional period. Old Babylonian institutions continued to function, while the Kassite elite gradually worked their way into the administration. The new kings adopted the Akkadian language and Babylonian religion, keeping the existing system of government, and relied on the old Amorite nobility, choices that secured their legitimacy for centuries. The early rulers, Agum II and his successors, rebuilt temples and brought back to Babylon the statue of Marduk, which the Hittites had once taken. This was a powerful symbolic act that reinforced both continuity and sacred kinship. The Kassite dynasty became the longest in Babylonian history, lasting for more than 4 centuries until the 12th century BC. It was a time of relative stability and growing international influence. Kassite kings pursued an active foreign policy, maintaining ties with Egypt, the Hittites, Elam, and Assyria. Surviving letters between Babylon and the pharaohs of Egypt's 18th dynasty show the rulers addressing each other as equals, the great kings of the age. These exchanges show that Babylon was seen as one of the main centers of power in the Bronze Age world. By the late 13th century BC, Babylon had begun to decline. Assyria was rising in power and steadily pushing Babylon out of its leading role. Toward the end of the century, during the reign of Kashtiliash IV, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I struck a decisive blow, defeating the Kassites around 1225 BC, capturing and plundering Babylon. Much of the Babylonian nobility was taken into captivity, and Kashtiliash himself was carried off to Ashur. This was the first time Babylon fell to the Assyrians. Tukulti-Ninurta crowned himself king and tried to rule through governors, but his control quickly collapsed. Rebellion broke out in Babylon, and in Assyria he was assassinated in a coup, throwing the kingdom into turmoil. The Kassite dynasty was restored, but its strength was permanently broken. The final blow came in 1155 BC, when the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunte captured Babylon, carried off the statues of its gods, including Marduk, to Susa, and ended Kassite rule once and for all. After the fall of the Kassite dynasty and the destruction of Babylon by the Elamites, southern Mesopotamia fell into chaos. Rival dynasties and warlords fought for power, while Assyria, now a major empire, began intervening more and more in the affairs of weakened Babylonia. The real turning point came under Tiglath-Pileser III, who pushed south in a campaign of systematic expansion. He formally brought Babylon under his rule, letting its kings keep their titles, but in practice reduced them just to vassals. Under his successors, Assyrian control only tightened, rebellions were crushed, disloyal rulers were deposed, and governors loyal to Ashur were installed in their place. Babylon remained a revered religious center, but politically it lived under constant Assyrian domination. In 729 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III took the title King of Babylon himself, ending even the pretense of independence. His successors, including Sargon II and especially Sennacherib, treated Babylon with little regard for its autonomy. In 689 BC, after yet another revolt, Sennacherib stormed the city, destroyed it completely, and diverted the waters of the Euphrates to flood the site, an attempt to erase Babylon from memory. The destruction sent shockwaves through Mesopotamia, for Babylon was still seen as one of the most sacred centers. Babylon's harsh treatment sparked unrest even inside Assyria itself. Sennacherib's successor Esarhaddon tried to make amends with a symbolic rehabilitation of the city. He rebuilt Babylon, restored the cult of Marduk, and sought to balance power between Nineveh and Babylon. To keep peace between the empire's two main centers, Esarhaddon divided authority while still alive. His son, Ashurbanipal, became the king of Assyria, while his other son, Shamash-shum-ukin, was made king of Babylon. On paper, this arrangement promised stability, but in reality it only sowed new conflict. Shamash-shum-ukin, raised in Babylonian traditions, held the royal title but had no real power. Assyria still controlled the army, the treasury, and all major decisions. In 652 BC, Shamash-shum-ukin rose in open revolt. He rallied the southern cities, won support from the Chaldeans, Arabs, and Arameans, and even forged alliances with Elam and Egypt. It was a bold, desperate attempt to restore Babylon's independence. For several years, fierce fighting followed, but the odds were never in Babylon's favor. Ashurbanipal brought the full strength of Assyria to bear, laid siege to Babylon, and in 648 BC captured the city. The revolt's failure dealt another heavy blow to Babylon's autonomy. From then on, Ashurbanipal imposed direct rule, appointing Babylon's kings himself. In the second half of the 7th century BC, Assyria, which had long dominated the Near East, began to decline. Years of constant wars, uprisings, and internal rivalries had drained its strength. After the death of Ashurbanipal, the empire fractured into competing centers of power, each fighting for control. For Babylon, this was the moment to rise again. In 626 BC, the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar led a revolt and drove the Assyrian garrisons out of Babylon. he was proclaimed king, marking the start of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Within a short time, he secured southern Mesopotamia, won over the local nobility, strengthened his rule, and prepared for the decisive clash with Assyria. The key to victory was his alliance with the Medes. Around 615 BC, their king Cyaxares attacked from the east, while Nabopolassar advanced from the south. In 614 BC, Ashur, the old Assyrian capital, fell, and in 612 BC, the Babylonian and Median armies stormed Nineveh. The city was utterly destroyed, and the last great Assyrian king, Sin-shar-ishkun, was killed in battle. From the ruins of the Assyrian Empire, Babylon emerged once more as the leading power of Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar's reign marked the city's rebirth as an independent force and the beginning of a new era in which Babylon again stood among the great states of the ancient Near East. After Nabopolassar's death in 605 BC, the throne passed to Nebuchadrezzar II. Under his reign, the Neo-Babylonian Empire reached the height of its power. In the early years, Nebuchadnezzar campaigned across the Levant, bringing city after city under his control and securing his dominance. In 597 BC, he laid siege to Jerusalem. King Jeconiah of Judah surrendered and was deposed. Nebuchadnezzar deported much of Judah's nobility along with the temple elite, military leaders, and skilled craftsmen to Babylon. On the throne of Judah, he placed his vassal, Zedekiah. But within a few years, Zedekiah allied with Egypt and attempted to break free from Babylon's grip. The response was swift. In 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar launched a second siege of Jerusalem. The city held out for nearly 2 years, but in 586 BC, the Babylonians broke through and Jerusalem fell. Solomon's temple, the central holy place of Judaism, was destroyed, the royal palace burned, and the city walls torn down to their foundations. Zedekiah was captured while trying to escape, his eyes were put out, and he was led in chains to Babylon. The population was deported, an event remembered as the Babylonian captivity. Along with his military campaigns, Nebuchadnezzar remade Babylon into the greatest city of its time. He launched an enormous building program on a scale unlike anything seen before. At its center stood the Temple of Marduk, the Esagila. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt and expanded this sacred complex, decorating it with cedar beams, gold, and fine stone. The temple was both a religious and political symbol. During the New Year festival, the king would ritually confirm his right to rule as Marduk's chosen. Towering above the city was the Ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Rising nearly 90 meters high, the massive stepped tower was believed to be the place where Marduk himself descended. Many see Etemenanki as the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, though others point to candidates like the Great Ziggurat of Ur. Babylon's defenses were just as remarkable. Nebuchadnezzar encircled the city with 2 rings of walls, divided by a water-filled moat. The outer wall was almost 7 meters thick, and the main entrance, the Ishtar Gate, was faced with deep blue glazed bricks and decorated with images of lions, bulls, and dragons, the sacred animals of Marduk and Ishtar. From the gate stretched the processional way, paved with stone and lined with lion reliefs, the route for the great ritual parades that led into the heart of the city. The king also built a magnificent palace on the eastern bank of the Euphrates. The complex included living quarters, a throne hall, storage rooms, and service buildings. Tradition says this was the site of the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytas, was a Median princess who had grown up in a cool mountainous climate. She found it hard to bear Babylon's heat and desert dust, so the king ordered the creation of lush, terraced gardens filled with fountains and plants that thrived in moisture. Later tradition sometimes called them the Gardens of Semiramis, but in reality, Semiramis was a Greek retelling of the name of the Assyrian queen Shemiramat, who lived centuries earlier and had no connection to the gardens. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for more than 40 years. His reign was the high point of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He secured Babylon's military dominance and left the grandeur of his empire imprinted on the very landscape of the city. Nebuchadnezzar II was succeeded by Amel-Marduk, who ruled for just 2 years before being overthrown by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, a powerful general. Neriglissar reigned until 556 BC, when the throne passed to his young son, Labashi-Marduk. The boy's rule was even shorter. He was murdered in a palace conspiracy. In the 6 years following Nebuchadnezzar's death, Babylon saw 3 kings rise and fall, each removed by a violent coup. The dynasty's authority was badly shaken, and the stability of the kingdom began to erode. In 556 BC, Nabonidus came to power, a remarkable and still puzzling figure. He was not of royal blood, but probably an official or general with connections to the priesthood. His reign is best remembered for a bold religious reform. Nabonidus tried to push the cult of Marduk into the background while promoting the worship of the moon god Sin. This angered the Babylonian priesthood and seriously undermined his legitimacy, since royal authority in Babylon was inseparably tied to the cult of Marduk. One of the biggest sources of resentment was that Nabonidus spent most of his reign away from Babylon. He left the capital and settled in Tema, an oasis in northern Arabia, where he focused on securing trade routes and controlling caravan traffic. In his absence, power in Babylon was left in the hands of his son, Belshazzar, remembered in the Bible as Belshazzar. The king's long absence was seen as both political weakness and a break in the sacred order, since he could not perform the traditional sacrifices to Marduk outside the city. Meanwhile, in the east, the Persian Empire was rapidly rising under Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered Media, Urartu, and Lydia, and was now turning his sights on Babylon. By 539 BC, the Persian army had crossed the Tigris and begun its advance. Nabonidus tried to muster resistance, but the Babylonian army was demoralized. The decisive battle came near the city of Opis, where Babylon's forces were completely defeated. Babylon did not fall by storm. Both Babylonian and Greek sources say that the city surrendered without a fight. According to one version, the Persians diverted the river and entered along its dry bed. According to another, the gates were opened by Babylonian nobles dissatisfied with Nabonidus. Nabonidus himself was captured while Belshazzar likely perished. Cyrus entered the city as a liberator, sparing the temples, preserving the cult of Marduk, and making a show of honoring the local gods. He proclaimed himself King of Babylon, King of all the lands, and the priesthood formally accepted his rule. Thus, in 539 BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to an end. It had lasted less than a century, but in that short time it became one of the most brilliant and powerful states in the ancient Near East. Babylon became one of the major cities in the Achaemenid Empire, one of its 5 capitals and the site of the royal treasury. Over time, though, its role began to change. The center of imperial administration shifted to Persepolis and Susa. Babylon remained wealthy and culturally vibrant, but its political influence steadily declined. It still held an important place in the bureaucracy, yet more and more it functioned as a regional hub rather than the empire's heart. In 331 BC, after defeating the Persians at Gaugamela, Alexander the Great entered Babylon. The city surrendered without resistance. He was welcomed as the new king of Babylon, and like Cyrus 2 centuries earlier, made a point of respecting local traditions. He ordered the restoration of the Esagila temple and began ambitious plans to rebuild the city. Alexander intended Babylon to be the capital of his world empire, but he spent only the final months of his life there, and in 323 BC, he died in Babylon, leaving his vision unfulfilled. After Alexander's death, Babylon passed into the hands of the Seleucids, one of the most powerful Hellenistic dynasties. At first, Seleucus I used the city as his administrative center, but soon he founded a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris. That decision marked a turning point. Babylon's economic and administrative functions were moved away, and the city quickly lost its importance. For a while, the temples still operated, and the priests continued to keep cuneiform chronicles, but the cultural and political center of the region had already shifted elsewhere. In the following centuries, Babylon steadily declined. Under the Parthians, it lay deep in the empire's interior and had no political weight at all. Cuneiform gradually disappeared, and the old priestly schools closed down. By the 1st century BC, Greek and Roman writers described Babylon as almost deserted, its temples crumbling, its canals silting up, and its fields overgrown with weeds. By the time the Arabs conquered Mesopotamia in the 7th century AD, all that was left of Babylon were ruins. Local people quarried bricks from the ancient temples to use as building material. The name Babylon survived, but only as legend, not as a living city. Thus ended the story of Babylon, a city that in the course of 2 millennia rose from a provincial settlement to an imperial capital, only to sink back into the sands of the Euphrates. Once again, if you've made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. We have a whole team behind this, and we really love seeing you follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations. We put out new content every single week. If you'd like to support the channel and help us make more videos like this, consider joining us on Patreon. You'll get early access to new episodes, work in progress updates, and more. Every bit of support goes a really long way. Thank you. You can also leave a super thanks down below if you'd like to give us a little extra boost. It really means a lot and helps us keep going. We hope to see you next time.